The government has to spend before it can collect taxes from the rest of us. You don't have to balance your spending and taxing necessarily. You can put more in than you subtract away. Banks create money out of thin air.
Hello everyone, welcome to Mitsuhashi TV. This program is sponsored by the organizing committee for the project to invite Professor Kelton and the subscribers of monthly Mitsuhashi. In January 2019, in referring to Green New Deal policies, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest ever congresswoman in the US, said MMT should be a larger part of the conversation. This triggered modern monetary theory to draw significant attention. For this program, we have invited a special guest, Stephanie Kelton, professor at Stony Brook University. Professor Kelton is a leading proponent of MTT, and she served as an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign and is currently serving as a senior economic advisor to him. We are going to broadcast this program in 3 parts. My name is Nao Koke. I'll be your MC. Thank you for joining us. The topic for part 1 is an overview of MMT. Japanese media covers MMT almost every day. Most of the articles are, however, written with negative tones. If this continues, MMT that would help Japan depart from deflation and help people become wealthier might be abandoned as a fad or voodoo economics. Against this backdrop, therefore, Mitsuhashi TV invited Professor Kelton to share correct knowledge about MMT with Japanese people. I would like to encourage the viewers to gain a correct understanding of MMT. All right, we have the pleasure of having Professor Stephanie Kelton from Stony Brook University for our special dialogue.
Professor Kelton, welcome to Japan and thank you for taking your time for us.
Thank you for having me.
Yesterday, an international symposium on MMT was held at the first members' office building of the House of Representatives. What is your impression?
Well, I think, several hundred people or more turned out to listen to an economist talk about MMT, probably after a long work day. And so I think it's pretty encouraging to see that kind of enthusiasm for the ideas here.
Understood. Actually, to organize this symposium, we solicited donations from the general public, and it turned out that over 2,500 people made donations.
That's incredible. As I understand, there were so many people who would have liked to have attended, but there wasn't the capacity. There just wasn't enough room for everybody who wanted to get in, and so just an overwhelming response.
So, with regard to MMT, modern monetary theory, I would like you to briefly give us an overview of the theory. Actually, I was listening to the symposium yesterday. You talked about Warren Modular business card story. That was very impressive.
Well, that's such a simple way to introduce people to the basic ideas behind MMT is using this little business card model that Warren Modular told me about more than 20 years ago, and it helped me better understand the nature of our monetary system, the one that we actually have today, using a little story about how he managed to get his kids working and producing around the house in order to earn his business cards. And so what that allows people to see is that, the currency, the yen, or in our country, the dollar, are considered valuable because the government requires people to earn them in order to settle their tax obligations to the state. And that really was a mind-opening sort of experience for me many years ago.
The reason why we are using Japanese yen in Japan is that the Japanese government is collecting tax in Japanese yen. Therefore, the government has to use Japanese yen in the first place. So that was an eye-opening remark on your part.
Yeah, I think that we're so used to thinking that the government needs our money in order to operate, when in fact the reverse is true. We're all required to earn the government's money in order to operate our own finances.
Now, MMT, the basic understanding of MMT, maybe the viewers do not understand very well, so could you highlight the important parts of the theory?
Sure. So one of the most important things I think that MMT teaches is that the government of Japan, in my country, the US, is the issuer of the currency. So the Japanese government issues the yen. And that makes them very different from a private business or a household, which we call users of the currency. And so the issuer of the currency can never run out of money, can never have bills coming due, payments that need to be made that it cannot make because it can't afford to do so. It can't go bankrupt, it can't run out of money, it doesn't face the same constraints that a household or a private business faces. And in fact, the government has to spend before it can collect taxes from the rest of us. It needs to make the yen available by spending the yen into the economy before the rest of us can have it and use it to pay taxes or spend on other consumption goods. So I think that's a central point of MMT, that the federal government issues the currency, everybody else is simply a user, and that gives the government powers that the rest of us don't have, that it isn't constrained the way that the rest of us are when it comes to spending.
So in other words, spending first is important.
Yes, so MMT reorders the sequencing, where we're used to thinking of the government taxing and borrowing to collect money and then spending. MMT flips that around and says that the government in fact spends first, and the taxing and borrowing are secondary operations. They follow the spending.
Another logic of MMT, which is very surprising or impressive, is that overt monetary financing, and without issuing debts, the government can spend money. I didn't know that.
It could do that. MMT doesn't require or even necessarily recommend that the government avoid selling bonds. So yeah, so it recognizes that the government has choices about whether to borrow in the first place, that the borrowing is a secondary operation. It comes after the spending. The government could choose not to issue JGBs. It could choose just to spend and then collect back a portion of what's spent and leave the rest of the yen in the economy. Or it could choose to swap the deficit spending, the yen from deficit spending, into JGB. So it's a choice the government can make, whether to do overt monetary financing or whether to conduct fiscal policy the way that it's conventionally done, which involves selling bonds.
Another point, not about the government, this is about private sector. In reality, bank deposits, actually we deposit money in the bank and we borrow money from them. However, when lending is done, already money is provided to the private sector. People didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about what banking is really about. And I think that even, the audiences that I talk to, a lot of financial experts and financial practitioners, if I ask them what banks do, they will often say banks lend other people's money. And I say, no, that's actually not correct, right? Banks create money when they lend. And so sometimes you can say to people, if you believe that banks lend other people's money, other people's deposits, then when was the last time that your bank called you and said, we just want to let you know next Tuesday your account balance is going to go down because we're going to lend some of your deposit to another customer? That never happens. And the reason that doesn't happen is because that's not how banking works. And so you're right, when a customer walks into a bank and asks to borrow money, if the bank thinks that that is a good credit-worthy customer, the bank makes the loan by changing the numbers in their account up, and the bank acquires the loan as an asset and increases the size of the customer's deposit. In other words, banks create money out of thin air.
Understood. Going back to the government topic, MMT explained one of the facts, which is that any government who issues local currency denominated debt does not have a fiscal constraints in budget, therefore they never default on debts. So this is not the logic, this is a sheer fact. However, Ministry of Finance in Japan in 2002 published a summary of letter to rating agencies stating that in the case of industrialized countries such as the US and Japan, defaulting on local currency denominated debt is unimaginable. This is posted on the homepage of the internet. Despite that, the Ministry of Finance scares the public by the risk of countries' financial bankruptcy and default of JGB's bonds. And also mass media follow suit as well.
Well, that's obviously unfortunate because the probability of default for a sovereign currency issuer is essentially zero. The only way in which a government like yours could default on obligations denominated in its own currency is if it voluntarily chose not to make the payments. It can never be forced into default. It can never be pushed into a situation where it has yen payments coming due and it simply can't find the yen to make the payments. Greece is very different, right? Because Greece has borrowed in euro, a currency that it does not issue. And so Greece really can get into a situation where the debt is coming due and the Greek government is unable to pay. That cannot happen in Japan, that cannot happen in the United States. For all intents and purposes, the probability of default is zero in those countries.
So when we talk about something like this, many of Japanese people will say that then the government will be able to issue currency endlessly. However, even if there is no budget constraint, there are other constraints, right?
That's right. So, former chairman of the Federal Reserve in our country, Alan Greenspan, has said very plainly that there is no limit to the government's ability to create US dollars. He says that they can do this in an unlimited capacity. So those are his words. It does have an infinite capacity to issue the currency, but that doesn't mean that the government should issue infinite quantities of dollars or that there is no real limit. And so there are constraints, and the constraints are in the real economy. There is an inflation constraint. So at the end of the day, too much spending by government can add to demand in a way that outstrips the economy's capacity to increase supply, and then you get what Milton Friedman said, right? Too much money chasing too few goods. That can happen. So you can have a situation where you do have too much money and the constraint is inflation, but what you can't have is a situation where you run out of money.
So the government of Japan currently has the fiscal target of the primary surplus. However, the discipline should be inflation rate. So inflation rate should be the target?
Right. So in MMT, we argue that it is never the correct objective for policymakers to target a budget outcome. That's the wrong way to approach public policy making. The right way to approach public policy making is to try to balance the overall economy, not the budget, but to balance conditions in the broader economy. And that means that you want an economy that's operating at its full potential without pushing things too far. In other words, respecting the inflation constraint, but maximizing the productive capacity of the economy. And it might require a budget deficit to get there. It might require small budget surplus. You just have to, there are other considerations about the right size of the deficit, but the objective should never be the budget balance. The objective should be balancing the broader economy.
In the symposium yesterday, listening to your presentation, I was moved because the government has to achieve the economic balance, even with fiscal deficit. That means the budget balance. That was the very impressive remark.
Yeah, so I would like to be able to redefine what we mean by fiscal responsibility and by what a balanced budget looks like. And so what I did with one of those slides yesterday was to show that the budget might not be in balance, but the economy might be in balance. And the goal is to achieve the balance for the economy. And if it requires an unbalanced budget to bring about a balanced economy, then we should call this a balanced budget.
Thank you very much. Koke-san, do you have any questions? Well, as I start to understand MMT more, I tend to think that the government doesn't need to collect tax. Would that be the case?
No. So it's an interesting point, because if you recognize that the government is the issuer of the currency, then it leads some people to say, well, then why don't you just issue the currency to pay for everything and stop taxing me, right, if you don't need my money? And the danger in that kind of thinking is that it overlooks the inflation constraint. So if the government were to just say, I have control of the currency, I can issue and spend at will, I'm not going to tax anymore. I'm just going to spend whatever I feel like spending. The problem is you would very quickly get an inflation problem. And so what taxes do is taxes subtract away some of the yen that the government spends into the economy so that you don't create an inflation problem. So you want to regulate how much you're subtracting away with a mind to avoiding the inflation problem. So you don't have to balance your spending and taxing necessarily. You can put more in than you subtract away, as long as the economy has the capacity to meet that deficit spending with higher supply.
Well, in terms of the roles of tax, when I explain that, I would say that in addition to regulating spending power of the government, built-in stabilizer is another role, and also redistribution of income to minimize inequality. What do you think?
Absolutely. So taxes play a very important role. First, if you wanted to start your own currency, you would probably start off by imposing a tax. That's what the Mosler business card example demonstrates, that if you want to begin a currency from scratch, the way to do that is to introduce a tax or some kind of other obligation. So taxes are important for driving the currency, we say in MMT. They're important for regulating aggregate demand, which means for regulating inflation. They're important for distribution. You want to have that lever to be able to adjust taxes if the distribution of wealth and income in the economy becomes so imbalanced that you think it's creating economic and or social problems. And you want to be able to adjust taxes to rebalance the distribution of income and wealth. And then finally, taxes are important because they allow you to create incentives or disincentives for certain behaviors. You might have a carbon tax or a gas tax to try to green your economy. You might have tax incentives to make it more affordable for people to buy clean energy, right? Electric vehicles or whatever. So taxes play a variety of important roles. What they don't do is pay for government spending.
Thank you very much. The next part of the program will be discussing MMT and Japanese economy using concrete data and graphs of a Japanese economy to deepen our understanding.
Oh, very good.
MMT についてもっと詳しく知りたいという方は、三橋貴明の最新刊知識ゼロからわかる MMT 入門、こちらが参考になります。こちらの方は書店では購入できません。こちらの QR コードからお買い求めください。